Obsolete Machines, a poetic historical reimagining of the Murney Fortification by Rielly Stairs. Old Kingston sunset time flower, the capital is closing and browning. Years before our duskin women dream of one another, going out, gathering supplies, and running the engine of their households, their hearts together in the same intent. Across the ocean, two women, Mrs. Sweeney, mother of Samuel Sweeney, matriarch of a British house in Southport, harvesting her gardens, making pies for sale, and helping the washerwoman with the clothes. The other, the mother of Amos Hanson, her young man also coming to the New World to protect British assets from the Americans' rebellion at 18 years old. When there is a mother, there are many, both back in time, each one connected to their ancestresses, and forward in time daughters, and laterally each one connected to the others by the heart of who raises a human being, whether she does it well or not, and whichever way she happens to do it. Mothers of the soldiers communicating with their hearts so long ago was an indigenous mother on the land here, and a far-off American settler mother also, and their influence was psychic, telemetric, and subconscious. Not always, but for all four on this particular day, there was the customary general distaste for the murder of innocent ones, and set up a trap to dismantle some of the sicker parts of a twisted hero structure if they can. Like mothers from time to time everywhere have done, they corresponded with one another through waves of thoughts that sing through the worlds. Women connected, of course, to their children through the womb with a long-term cell-sharing bond. These two white-skinned mothers say, "Protect this child of mine. May he not die in battle in this strange new land." The one indigenous mother, she wrapped in deerskin, preparing some food for the fire, does assent for her part. The settler mother, listening to her elder ancestress grumble about the new weaponry, in her heart says, "Yes, in this case it shall be done." A wagon and a ship that day so long ago, for the two mothers away taking their youngest sons with their kits. For lads Hanson and Sweeney the New World awaited, a long journey on boats with water oceans and paddle steamers bunkers to the capital town in loyalist Upper Canada in Kingston. Originally mother-coddled sons were long ago sent into the machine of British military by their fathers, the father doing what the other fathers did. As with any machine, there were inputs and there were outputs to this social contraption made of an organization of male beings. They put their boys in to get something else out. A son dressed smartly in military wear, separated from an unnatural connection to his mother, the removal of an exasperating rival for one's wife's affections. The machine is a close guarantee their sons would grow into men who would appreciate their father's heroes enough to emulate them, who would be in touch with the exciting conversation of the world and its knickknacks and gadgets, who would be fascinated by all the things a man can do and be and the places he can see. Best friends these two mothers had made from their sons so suddenly disappeared off to some new place. On that day, Hanson and Sweeney separately arrived in the New World, and on this later day, when both soldiers are in the prime of their adulthood, September storms seem to rage everywhere on the river they traveled. Long ago it storms to answer the anger of mother skies at their perceived father wrong-minded sending away, these ones in particular, and their father-son rivals. An answering storm has been found to meet the call from long ago. These two young men grew older on 15 years of missions and maneuvers in the New World, protecting Upper Canada as the British military formed an official relationship and balance between England and the United States. Their parents now aging in England, these lads approached the same port town. The stormy metal air in the settler regions boomed all the way from Lake Ontario to the St. Lawrence River. The drift into the bay at Kingston on a clear day would have given them a view of the stately, gorgeous government construction now known as City Hall, which had shortly before this been hollowed out of British government and officials. Rooms rented on the inside to businesses to feed the simplified municipality amongst military and religious structures nearby. Without the benefit of this landmark, looking out over fortresses and forests, it was still very wild. miles and miles of amphibious swamplands and wetlands. Hansen thought of how he would describe Kingston in his next letter home, one that, as always, would be addressed to his mother only. The storm slowed down to a standing fog as they approached the shore of the hilltop fort. A heavy, beautiful opaque mist curtain and foghorns sounded, and cool waves pushed a curling ribbon into the harbor town, where barely visible men and women everywhere milled around in the early morning, drunken persons asleep amongst the early morning cargo, or stumbling out from behind crates and buildings. Washing women and maids rushed along the street here and there, and women who had been up all night hurried home. Boats constantly trafficked. The smell of fish, in with animals and goods and people, are emptied and rolled away. Many goods churned through the market and storefronts, fires, processing, and packaging, displaying throughout by the hands of men and women of all ages and youth. The street alternately dirt and rock, cobblestone and paved ways, from the wooden docks and piers, interrupted everywhere with train tracks, and the slow chug whistling and steaming still beasts crawling slowly to their spot to unload. Teams of fishermen and trappers, traders, washerwomen, servants, seagulls disappearing and reappearing out of the fog overhead laughing. Also cloaked in mist, Queen's University has indeed a forest established in a royal charter issued by Queen Victoria, a mother of 9 over 17 birthing years. So small buildings housed the school and a large swath of treed land by the shore. So many years ago, remembering the details they knew about the British military entity took their sons, their mothers' minds flew to detect the subtle energy psychically as far as they could go. These two women attempted to smooth a way throughout their young men's careers, and even now, a decade and a half later, their mothers' minds followed every thread. This was just one of the things the women sought to accomplish. Also, thinking of Kingston and its future are that particular indigenous mother and landowner whose brothers died defending their mutual land from the rebel Americans, hand in hand with the British, and an American rebel mother whose brothers died at indigenous hands. Back then, the rebel soldiers marched through snow in a strategic error, and then the weakened American rebels were easily finished off by native fighters. All four mothers were sick of war. The indigenous mothers' peoples had been literally sick, as many other native peoples were, from exposure to Europeans' communicable diseases, and died. And maybe they all, to a greater or lesser extent, have historically made particular pets out of their youngest sons, for whatever reason, reminded in some maybe of their dear brothers who died. So Sweeney and Hansen's mothers said from the beginning, may all plans for war be forgotten for these men who were once our little boys, and although they might think mainly of their mothers, may our children know great romantic love, and go to a place where they can love beyond us. May their war headquarters be spoiled with peace and romance, and some concept of beauty. They imagined the going new man, so from their bodies womb their face and their arms, and the womb of the family home, to the aura of a peace-drenched place, the ankles of the mother love, wished long ago pinched as baby boys to evermore wankle on terminally peaceful roads. Mrs. Hansen in Britain thinks of the baby ankles of her pet man's son, and how willing she would be to see his feet then bleed to keep him from dying on the thresh of a battlefield. And for Sweeney and Hansen's mothers, as little boys, had always written beautiful little love letters for their mothers. They held two hearts with maternal laughter. Maybe I'm all you need. Maybe you'll never need to go loving other women, they think in humor. Ah, many times Mrs. Sweeney sent along a parcel of food provisions overseas to a new station, and she does so again this time, and sits at her headquarters and reads the newspaper, determined to do all kinds of psychic deeds beyond. An old Mohawk man, for whom this place Cataraqui has long been a trading post, who helped the British fend off the American rebels in the War of 1812, one autumn day watched as boatloads of carted rocks and mud to be cleared lot on the shore to build another of many small armed fortresses to protect the border. Well, at the time of its building, those indigenous fighters promised the security of ownership agreements for the land they lived on in exchange for fighting alongside the British, yet do not receive it, and the first residential school, another thresher of sorts, has opened. Long after these days, this little King Street fortification in question gleams in white layers of brick like a smooth cake from the side of the water. 37 years in its history beings lived in this structure, ostensibly defending. 2 more mothers now close to the heart living in Kingston, contemporaneous to this story. One is Mrs. Angela Schilte, the only female person at the time, living in what will someday be called the Murney Tower, with her 3 small boys, her husband Geoffrey Schilte, teen military men, soon to be 20, with the arrival of Hanson and Sweeney. Angela is cooking breakfast for her sons, aged 4, 6, and 8, over the fire in the kitchen and telling them a story about horses that gallop across the sky. Her best efforts put forward toward the perseverance of their imaginations against what is unprivate, crowded, unnecessary, arbitrary, and obviously not ideal in these living conditions. For a second Kingston mother, we have the formidable and talented Margaret Grist, the younger sister of Mother Hanson in England, and aunt of our experienced newcomer soldier, Amos Hanson. She's the living dame of her family, residing within a 20-minute ambling walk to City Hall from the northeast. Soldier Amos Hanson, gaining this Kingston recruitment, thinks of his dazzling aunt and schemes to possibly marry her 30-year-old daughter, his first cousin Leonora, for practical purposes. He hopes and even imagines that Leonora is preparing herself for his company. Heart beating, he boldly projects himself into her future. Sweeney and Hanson, after being away from their home in England for so many years, recognized in young recruits look of bewilderment boated over from Britain directly, joining the fort in this loyalist place. Urgent and freshly frantic seemed younger ones watching everything as they do exercises for the first time on the military square in this strange wild land. Sweeney, Hanson, and others experienced soldiers arrived in Kingston, taking signature of a British government deal to coercing mature military members to stay in Canada, accepting them into the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment, otherwise known as the Froggers. This recruitment presented to older soldiers as an alternative to deportation back to England featured very good wages, pensions, the potential for gifts of land, a practical, certain, secure setup for our 2 over-weathered, mother-loved men. Hundreds of soldiers in the fort on drills. Behind him, Hanson notices an altercation. Ready to do drills, one of the new young British arrivals is struck on the back of the neck by an officer, a short, stocky man using the butt of a rifle, and warned for clowning out. "Who do you think you are?" a red-haired officer Lark shouted at excessive volume. Unacquainted, Sweeney and Hanson had a look at Lark and then at each other, and found a surprisingly sophisticated cohesion and immediate understanding there. "Who is that piece of garbage?" said Sweeney. "Officer Lark has been put in charge of the project today," someone else said. "So that's why he's both drunk and hungover, obviously." "Are they going to correct him?" Hanson said, observing the superiors standing around. They saw it happen, but apparently not. Even the new recruits seem embarrassed for Upper Canada. Clean new energy versus wet rust. Young new recruits stared off past each other, as if processing the interpersonal reality of the place. Lark then approached the edge of the square where the other soldiers had gathered. "Wait, why is he coming over here? He can't be specifically ours, can he?" said Sweeney. Lark made a blunt, threatening gesture with his lower jaw at Sweeney and Hanson. Someone said, "Thankfully, no. We just have him for the morning while he orientates us. The other officer is meeting us at the gun house." "Good," said Sweeney. The early morning next hour, loading provisions into carts and preparing to leave the fort, Lark commanded and reacted with volatility like an animal in pain, on the edge of tears or violence at the least practical problem, desperately demonstrated bodily a perpetual potential threat, an irritation, and an obstacle. To his credit, not giving up, with little power to self-moderate. Lark was at least luckily also absent-minded, and lost track of fights he'd started. Lark mocked the new arrival Hansen for being slow, and attempted to shove him, while Hansen carried the crates they were setting into carts. A momentary lapse on Hansen's part, who was trying to hide blister pain from new boots. He focused on the incredibly good wage he and all present were receiving, and cheerfully Hansen sped up. This opportunity was worth more than temporary foot pain and an overblown, blustering, inexplicable Officer Lark. Hansen, with the speed to get out of the way, avoided Lark, who stumbled over, landing on the ground with his hands. The officer then shouted and sputtered impatiently, roaring with reaction, prying himself up. They stifled laughter and began to perceive it was a matter of doing as they were told, and patiently waiting for Lark to think of the correct steps which most every other person could perceive clearly in the moment. Finally the Froggers left the fort, and marched and carted down a road with morning lanterns, descending into the milky fog that enveloped everything at sea level. They marched and rolled toward the wooden Cataraqui penny bridge, looking spectral in the fog, the simple enmisted precursor to the La Salle Causeway. When they got to the harbor, they loaded their provisions into boats that would travel down the shore to their eventual destination. Finally, the Froggers all left the fort and marched and carted down a road with morning lanterns, descending into the milky fog that enveloped everything at sea level. When they got to the harbor, they loaded their provisions into boats that would travel down the shore, that would travel across the river to their eventual destination. They marched across the wooden bridge. Lark sent 2 of the men in the boat, and he walked with the rest of the soldiers in their section toward the city, surrounded in white mist. In the heart of the fog, bankers, masons, saloon keepers, actors from the theater, and police officers teemed in and out of the gleaming, now multifunctional and expensive, crowded, newly built government building turned city hall. A structure which the soldiers barely detect at first as they marched beside the shipyards, crossed everywhere by new trains that were ringing along, also at a walking pace, for the Grand Trunk Railway and the Kingston Street Railway. Activity of the place could be heard first. Hundreds of people milled the hard-working and complex industrial harbor. Soldiers and Lark marched away along King Street's shoreline, residences and mansions, eventually to the newly built Frogger Fortress gunhouse that would house themselves as ostensible weapons too. Boats already docked upon their arrival, personnel lifted crates to the shore. With her 3 boys sat our mother, Angela Shilty, who was shouting to her children to stay away from the soldiers and out of the ditch. Under her breath she said, "Look at this," looking at Lark, and calls her boys over to her. Most of the men stationed there for some time automatically go about their duties. The interfering Officer Lark rudely shouts orders the soldiers a list of things to accomplish, violently gesturing as if generating efficiency with his irritation. Cooking breakfast and bringing down the lanterns around the fortress, an observation when Lark is occupied, blustering over something. How could they put that monster in charge of anything? Flatly and efficiently, Sweeney says to Hansen. What he said is heard by many, and no one reacts except Angela Shilty, who scoffs and glares in the direction of Lark, now held her 3 kids close to her, and said under her breath, "Someone needs to put him away." Soon the tall, stout, sophisticated, and reserved Officer Price, who was in charge of the regiment, arrived from his breakfast. Lark left a sputtering sentence unfinished when he saw Price, scowled, and wordlessly disappeared like a spectre on the boat. Soldier cooks lighting fires in the kitchen, and someone has told Sweeney and Hansen where to get their blankets and sheets to make their beds, and where to put their kits. Hansen leaned against the round wall. In lantern lights, "I need to wrap my ankles with gauze," looked around at the place that would be their home, a cavernous and echoey living space, where his voice was amplified and bleared its way along the rock. There are 8 people in the room. Sweeney disappears to another floor of the structure to procure gauze from Angela Shilty. "Gauze," Angela said. "Show me." Angela, all 3 of her children with her, asking questions and puttering around, does her own assessment of Hansen's bleeding feet, brings him hot soapy water in a basin and cloths, bandages, and she washes the wounds and wraps them expertly. "Looks like you need wider boots." Air rises and the fog blows off, leaving a clear, cool fall day with sunshine sometimes smiling through the clouds, and the soldiers again march back beside the docks to the fort on parade drills. Light disappears early at this time of year, and its retreating golden light makes City Hall glow pink like a cake of its own, and brings out a bright mango orange in the southwestern sky over the water. The regiment marches back as lamps are lit, and enter the cavernous, echoing darkness of the weaponized fortress. After the introduction of their new tall soldiers, sentinels are assigned for watching in the night, and the evening meal is served. Besides Hansen and Sweeney, who it seems just wanted to talk to one another, everyone begins talking about women, an apparent constant preoccupation, self-incentivized at this stage as these soldiers were to find someone to marry. Also they discuss music, who can play an instrument and if they have any with them, where they can go to find music, women, and dancing. The soldiers play games, drink, and gamble with each other, and obsessively caretake their clothing and accessories, brushing, washing, sponging, and protecting each piece, polishing their boots, using nail brushes and emollients, planning their trips to the barber. When the government officials disappeared from Kingston, only a fraction of the capital's social calendar survived. In the theater, the dance halls, the pubs, the gambling dens, the dining halls, the private homes, men seeking women overwhelmingly outnumbered marriageable women, and all of the whorehouses were busy. Business was suddenly booming for fallen women and body actress theater. Poverty was noticeable. Unlimited amounts of mud on every street that happened to be unpaved in this extremely fertile swath of land came from furious storms, and another autumn week of glorious fall trees shut out, the oncoming week's early fall snowstorming a sobering hard bite of winter. Clothing and provisions are tested with the need for constant cleaning of boots and clothing, constant drying of items by the fire, the need for reinforcements and duplicates of clothing pieces. In the parts of the fortress that aren't used as sleeping and eating quarters, cold terminally blows in through the artillery vents around the soldiers. Few of the workers across the city in the elements, either on the docks removing goods from boats and putting them onto trains, or open-air merchants, are really warm enough or dry enough, unless there is a fire in front of them. Everyone feels the vulnerability that comes from wet, numb feet and maneuvering and climbing over the ubiquitous ice and mountains of snow. Snow removal is ongoing and slow. The howling winds, waves, scrunching ice walks through freezing rain accumulate and sloshing together, with freezing shoreline arriving off the water's solid blast. There continues a daily routine of marching, physical drills, artillery tests, and checks. The soldier Amos Hansen falls on the ice and badly sprains his leg, hobbles over to the new shoreline hospital, and carriages back with crutches to walk on for at least 2 weeks. Samuel Sweeney agrees to go to the shops for him, fetches Amos his new boots from the cobbler, and clothes from the tuck shop and the merchants. Though now your left boot won't close around your ankle for a while, Sweeney said, returning, Hansen's swollen foot burning with pain. With his new boots done up as best he can on his sore left foot and dressed in their beautiful and carefully kept mess kits, newly acquainted 35-year-olds, Amos Hansen with his wooden crutches, and the swarthy Samuel Sweeney, both dashing, tall, strapping, and debonair, a separate kind of human animal in a pair, carriaged over to Aunt and Uncle Grist's residence for dinner. In a beautiful limestone house near some farmland at the edge of the city on James Street, Mr. Grist was a local clothing merchant. The befeathered, befurred, and bejeweled Aunt Margaret screamed and cried when she saw the men, and barely went 5 minutes the whole visit without holding or patting both men's hands, touching their faces and hair. Sweeney and Hansen were completely at home, very much missing this kind of womanly behavior their mothers raised them on. After so many years, they finally felt understood and cared for in this strange land. Aunt Margaret was going to make the perfect mother away from home for both of them, and possibly a perfect mother-in-law for Amos Hansen. If only one could marry the mother, both men thought, but somehow that wasn't right either. Margaret asked intently and tearfully about her older sister, Amos's mother, whose picture decorated the mantel, and also asked Samuel Sweeney about his family back in England. Extensive news from home was relayed by each, who wrote to their mothers at least weekly. Margaret's 30-year-old daughter, Leonora Grist, reservedly descended for dinner. Hansen had already imagined the night's conversation, which he had discussed with Samuel Sweeney. He was expecting innuendo. He was hinting that he would make an excellent prospect for Leonora, and that naturally aunt and uncle would see him as Leonora's savior, saving her from spinsterhood. To the surprise of Hansen and Sweeney, the subject didn't really come up, and there seemed to be no opening to discuss it. Mr. Grist talked about his experience becoming a businessman and the recession after the retreat of the governing powers from Kingston, and how it could easily be reversed with time, courage, hard work, and greater economic cooperation. He considered at length the importance of adoptively welcoming new people into the middle class and inviting them into society with gifts and opportunities. Furthermore, Uncle Grist said that in that spirit he would like to introduce Hansen and Sweeney to some of the other men that were in business downtown. Hansen thought about saying with cheek, "And what about those businessmen's daughters?" but then thought that might come off as crass or even disingenuous, since truthfully he rarely thought about women, except in the context of it being advisable that every man marry one at some point. His one and only plan on this front was to marry Leonora, his first cousin, and until now it didn't occur to him that this might not work. He and Sweeney at some point looked at each other, internally reassessing the goal of the evening. It seemed strange to the men that Leonora somehow didn't seem grateful or desperate. The truth of what that meant was hanging in the air. The men had a feeling that there was a woman's way of looking at this situation entirely differently, but was so strange to them that they couldn't imagine it. Samuel Sweeney, an excellent improviser, entertainingly talked about the difference between the Canadian province and Britain, meatheads in the military, what was wrong with the plays they'd seen in town, Hansen's boots that were too tight and his sprained ankle, new ways of thinking about politics and life, and even the pension they were receiving as members of the Froggers, if they could just manage not to break the rules or murder an officer lark. Eventually, at a loss, but wanting to help, Sweeney began to compliment Hansen openly, which also seemed to accomplish nothing, except that it made Hansen blush and smile. Maybe the bookish Leonora wasn't interested in being married anyway. Now, staring into her confusing, bored brown eyes, it seemed to Hansen that she had long ago made up her mind about him somehow, or herself, or both. All questions leading to the topic of marriage seemed easily and automatically redirected. Hansen scrambled to intuit or invent something besides his pension and his possible land that would make him valuable to her. If courting a woman were this hard with someone familiar, it might be impossible with a woman who was a complete stranger and surrounded by younger and more direct men. And she clearly already had money. What use did she have for him? He was willing to reinvent his whole personality on the spot, or negotiate with his aunt and uncle very directly, like in the purchase of a horse, but there just seemed no place to do this. In his mind, any woman would do, and Amos wondered why it didn't seem like just any man would do for this woman, who was, after all, just like any other slightly forgotten woman, wasn't she? Anyway, the way most men talked when they had chosen a lady, somehow they seemed to be able to find a side woman for other occasions too, and that was all well and good, wasn't it? How important could it be who the first woman was in that context? Otherwise, it was all the same to Hansen. He might be just as content to marry Sweeney, whom he had just met, for all that mattered to him. At least Sweeney was kind to him, and good for a laugh, although he wouldn't stand in the way of Sweeney's prospects. Handsome and swarthy and entertaining as he was, though Leonora seemed immune to Sweeney's charms too. Being married seemed like what people went around doing. How could he participate? At the end of an elaborate meal served by maids, Margaret clicked open her red velvet-lined violin case, got out her instrument, rested her bow on the strings dramatically for a few moments, and began to play. Her musical line was eloquent and descriptive, playful and inviting. It said, "Let's talk about the world and everything. Let's imagine an ideal time for ourselves. Let's go live in the stars together. Let's sing our music onto the sky. Let's make this new place a temple of the mind." Sweeney, clapping as she finished, almost said, "I forgot that women could play instruments," which was the truth, except he intuited this comment might sour in this woman-forward household. So he simply said bravo and beamed. After the performance and lots of fireside talking, Amos and Samuel's carriage was loaded up with food and gifts to both of them from Aunt Margaret, including baskets, some new blankets, pieces of framed artwork, table linens, rugs, and fur throws, cake, candle holders, some candles, the rest of the bottled wine, some cheese, and half a roast to share with the other soldiers. Aunt Margaret walked the men out and embraced warmly. She produced a ruby ring from the pocket of her fur coat and slid it onto Hanson's index finger. This belonged to your great-grandmother, Veronica. I'm sure she's watching over you, Amos. You really remind me of her. Amos looked at the red jewel and felt a lovely connection to the piece. He kissed his aunt with real gratitude. As they rolled away in the carriage, both men were waving and smiling, but as they turned the corner, Hanson made a frustrated and bedeviled sound. Well, Sweeney led, Hanson said quietly, how did I get it so wrong? Sweeney wrapped his friend in Aunt Margaret's fur stole. Don't be sad, Amos. Maybe she's too modest to see herself as your wife. Perhaps everyone here is thinking you deserve better than a rude, overly intellectual 30-year-old spinster with thick spectacles, buck teeth, terrible hair, and bad skin, and no sense of style. Anyway, you haven't actually proposed yet. Keep that in mind. You are still in the game. They sat in silence for a while, and Sweeney squeezed Amos's hand. There has to be a woman here for me. Leonora Grist or someone else, Amos said. That's the spirit, said Sweeney with feeling. Maybe for both of us, Sweeney. Twin spinsters. Yes, Hanson, twin spinsters. When they got back to the fortress, the young family had already gone to bed, so Hanson offered to share the food and drink with the soldiers who happened to be in and playing cards for money by candlelight, and they openly discussed Leonora Grist. After speaking to the other men, Sweeney suggested inviting Leonora Grist for a walk so that Hanson could get more of a feeling for her personality, which it seemed for some reason was necessary. Hanson said that if he had to talk to her alone, he'd want to bring someone along. Sweeney, for instance, for his easy conversation and idealness in so many other ways. As Hanson and Sweeney retired to their cots, spreading out the new rugs and blankets and propping up their new art pieces, they noted that maybe it was women's liberation that was making courtship so difficult. In the light of an uncharacteristically hot summer-like stretch of fall weather for a few days at the end of October that melted all the snow and brought crowds out to the parks, Kingston seemed like a new place. One day in this October heat wave, one of the soldiers was getting married. Men from the regiment who were in the bridal party stayed at accommodations that had been leased out for the occasion. The bride's family engaged an orchestra, and a reception and dance were planned in one of the rooms of City Hall. Clothing and shoes for the bridal party, flowers, wine, food, and music were all keeping local businesses and providers moving. Private and hired carriages arrived and lined up along Ontario Street full of guests. The soldiers from the small fortress all traveled to City Hall by hired carriage. Hanson on his crutches and Sweeney there for support. Both of them were wearing their fanciest mess kits with capes, gloves, and impeccably shined shoes, and Hanson was wearing great-grandmother Veronica's ruby. For the occasion, the day before, Sweeney had taken Hanson shopping. It had been a particularly beautiful afternoon for shopping. The colors on the trees downtown were dazzlingly beautiful, and the hot shards of sun darted to the eyes on the shoreline as they hailed a carriage to go back. Now night had fallen in Kingston, and the lamps were lit, and town life after dark had begun. Sweeney helped Hanson out of the carriage and straightened up his friend's cape. How incongruously different they were from everyone else, and how similar they were to each other. The two spotted Officer Lark, very drunk, sitting on the steps of City Hall, belligerently addressing a police officer who was questioning him. Samuel Sweeney helped Amos Hanson up the steps, and they were coming into the rooms just as the beautifully dressed Angela Schilte, her husband, and her 3 children were on their way to a carriage back to the fortress, who would be happy to have some long-awaited privacy from the other men for the night. Hanson and Sweeney greeted them as they left. They found a table, and Sweeney elevated Hanson's leg on a vacant chair. Sweeney and Hanson surveyed the prospects, and immediately focusing on the goal, which they had previously discussed, to find Hansen a woman to marry. Sweeney planned to dance with women and bring them back to the table to meet Hansen. Sweeney immediately stood up and began searching for a lady with whom to share a dance. Most every woman was spoken for or entranced by one of the younger soldiers who, for some reason, perhaps because of their youth, Sweeney thought, had a much more palpable interest in the women that the females found convincing. Even the older unmarried women had men attending to them. Hansen sat with some other soldiers whose eyes were also sharp to find the women who were present. Hansen watched Sweeney with hope, and letting his eyes drift through the room, he spotted someone sitting alone in a corner by a wall, almost obscured by a heavy curtain, her head propped up with her hand, looking distracted. He realized it was his cousin, Leonora Grist. She was wearing a beautiful gray dress, which Sweeney later remarked was styled all wrong, with beat-up sensible leather shoes, navy blue wool knee socks with at least one hole, and an oversized wool cardigan of some strange color, incongruously a scarf, and a string of multicolored pearls running from one arm of her spectacles behind her neck to the other, so that they hung like a necklace when they slipped off her nose. She slowly sipped champagne, and from Hansen's vantage point he could see when he looked closely that she was reading a book she was hiding from sight on her lap, and was eating cookies wrapped in paper she'd brought from home from her purse. For Hansen there was a euphoria and relief in seeing her there, looking so dowdily unattractive and unintimidating. By now Sweeney, momentarily forgetting to locate a prospect for Hansen, was dancing expertly with Aunt Margaret Grist. Mr. Grist, smoking Cuban cigars with his business acquaintances, was deep in discussions. Hansen drank the rest of his champagne, headed crutched over to the figure of Leonora Grist, and asked if he could sit with her. She said fine, but it was clear that she would rather be reading. He asked her what she was reading, and she showed him the cover of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. The title and author meant nothing to Hansen, except he noticed it was a novel by a woman. After some standard questions eliciting perfunctory answers from Leonora, they sat in silence for a time. Then Leonora said, "What makes a person like you want to be a soldier anyway?" "Ah, well, it was my father's idea, but it's okay. It brings in money. I'm used to it, and I'm a pretty good shot." There was a brief silence, and Amos said, "I was going to ask you if you wanted to get married ever to me, because we could. I could ask your father any time. Or would you want to marry anyone?" Leonora Grist closed her eyes and drank the rest of her champagne. "Are you not a homosexual?" "What was that?" "Aren't you in a homosexual relationship with Samuel Sweeney?" she persisted. Sweeney came over suddenly from the dance floor, beaming at Hansen, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, one of which he put in front of his friend. The other he sat down with. The friendly Sweeney declared, "You've found each other." "I'd like an answer to my question," she said to Hansen. "Sorry, I missed that. What was your question?" said Sweeney, misunderstanding. Immediately Mrs. Grist also sat down at the table. "What was your question?" said Mrs. Grist to Leonora. "I said," said Leonora, looking pointedly at Hansen, "are you a homosexual?" "Leonora," said Mrs. Grist, "don't be vulgar. Don't pay any attention to her. She didn't even want to come here tonight. Let's be nice to your cousin. Nobody needs this kind of interrogation. I don't know what's put you in this mood. You don't have to answer that. It's nobody's business." "That's all right," Hansen said. "No harm done." Sweeney laughed. "It's an easy mistake." Awkwardly, the table collectively changed the subject, and Sweeney brought Hansen drinks and danced with many of Mrs. Grist's rich married friends who otherwise were in talks with each other about charitable fundraisers for the Christmas season. In the carriage on the way home, Hansen told Sweeney that he had proposed to his cousin, and discussed her reaction. Sweeney replied, "I don't understand where she would come up with that. How do women learn about these things? I liked it better when men could do what they wanted in private without women even knowing about it. Frankly, that sort of thing is none of their business. They're so sheltered. They seem to blow everything out of proportion. When you put it that way, who in the military isn't a little bit homosexual from time to time? What does that mean? What does that term mean? How could that term mean anything? You should be so proud of yourself. I say be patient and ask her again in a while. Changes make everyone nervous. Give her some time. I'll be there to help you along whenever you need me. You've had a long night, Amos, Sweeney said, his hand on Hanson's knee. The next morning the church bells at St. George's sounded out, and all the congregants came together, and Angela and her soldier husband and the children were all accompanied by the soldiers. After the service, Sweeney and Hanson ran into the grists. Amos invited Leonora to join he and Sweeney for a walk, which she abruptly declined, with a flimsy excuse, the flimsiness of which she did not try to disguise. It was an amazingly hot day as the men returned to the fortification. Some of the soldiers were stripping into the water of Lady River, moving constantly onto the shore, and soon so were Sweeney and the rest of the men, innocently shouting, roaring with sound and singing. The soldiers in semi-nudity played as Hanson watched by the shoreline in a wooden chair, foot elevated and peeling an apple with a paring knife. They built a fire to enjoy, and Sweeney and Hanson and all the rest sang together. The happy exercises, some invitations here and there, and cards and letters and small gifts from home made a perfect day. Nice feelings and leisure came after welcome heat and hot sun, coming all the raucous day, and sending letters back to their families occupied the Frogger men. 3 women came to the fortification, whom the mature Frogger soldiers were courting or engaged to. One was a widow, and 2 of them were working women of some kind, who were older and had never been married. The visiting women lifted up and carried Angela's youngest boy, imagining to be a mother for a few minutes, and seemed to talk to each other and Angela easily, as though they were sisters, in another kind of language altogether, milling around everyone in the place, cooking and cleaning and laughing together like they were playing house. Hanson saw how naturally the men and women interacted, and thought about what a distance there was between he and most women who were not already someone's mother or grandmother. The women discussed making the gun house prettier, cutting evergreen boughs, and getting the men to gather them, hanging them on the door and inside the fortification, and adorning them with ribbons one of them had bought. It was a novelty for the men to see the women of their fixations taking charge of beautification and trying on being the mistress of the household. There were tendrils of aesthetic beauty reaching into the future in everything they did that the men could see and believe in. They were cooking a larger dinner that night, more than usual, an allowance made by everyone wanting to contribute their many separate purchases at the market that day. Alcohol was being poured. There was fiddling and singing with the women as long as they would stay. They tended fires, and the reflection of flames glinted off the stone walls, and from an 80-year-old fiddle passed down from someone's granddad, being tried with energy by some of the soldiers. This place with so much male energy triangulated attention. The female eyes dart everywhere on impulse. In this heady atmosphere, the women speak boldly about their mothers and their families, futures and marriages. There seemed to be a private joke the women were smiling and laughing about together. The last woman left walked home by her betrothed soldier, and even after they were gone, the fortress vibrated with feminine energy. On a flat rock, enjoying the fire, the dark-haired Sweeney lolled, whom everyone could see was remarkably beautiful when half-dressed and without his cap. The men are rehashing the events of the day and discussing the women and how they looked. One of the soldiers said that his girl is poor and he makes enough money to tell her mother to get pushed. They talked exactly as if it were all a game, discussing their next moves, rudely discussing the business of marriage and its prize. Even though Amos Hanson had made that same analogy in his mind, there was something crude about this way of referring to it. While the others tell stories and talk lewdly about women, they ask Sweeney for his opinion. He says vaguely that he did not think love was going to come to him, that he just could not believe it. "I don't know if I'm meant for it," he said. "I've always been more of an entertainer. I get bored when I don't have an audience. Except with Hanson, but that's different obviously." In the shoreline gun house, in the warm air, Sweeney watches Hanson remove his shoes to wash his feet in water from the fire, and imagines kneeling down and wrapping Hanson's ankles in gauze, which he wished he could have done the first day just as well as Angela Schilte did. The cold and wind returns on the arrival of November, messages issued back and forth from the fort bringing changes. To the delight of the mother, a private home has been prepared in town for Angela Schielty, her soldier husband, and 3 boys. This little family will move to Queen Street, it is decided. As soon as possible they say goodbye, and the horses cart their possessions through the snow. The remaining soldiers then are an all-male company, factually living inside a stationary weapon, ostensibly to be ready at all times to wage war with an enemy who was absent. This with weapons that were obsolete as soon as they were installed. They are all drifting slowly into the awareness of a situation, that they are to some degree extraneous, a realization stretching out the days like a dog in the sun, warming the air imperceptibly to the change, though the winter was present, so that again their breath could be seen in the cold air, and the ice quickly formed on the edges of the river to be covered over by a layer of snow, and then another. The soldiers who were willing to see the truth in the situation are tending to drink and joke. Officer Price officially declares that he will spend most of his nights away in town with his wife, which frankly he did anyway since Sweeney and Hanson moved in. Everyone feels involved in a particular spirit heat of cohesion and change. Some of the men are actively proposing to women and planning their futures, and who of them has managed to do this redefines things. There are inevitably actions to take in the evening anyway, but some of the soldiers just end up in the company of other men at the town's taverns, and visiting busy brothels in the French part of town, Ann Street, Picard Street, and Carlisle. Every evening possible, men are out in the search. A changing handful of soldiers opt for an inexpensive and subdued evening, eating dinner together, what was happening in town, and the latest marriage-oriented developments in terms of the other men. Something has changed with the absence of Angela and her young family, in that it's brought all individual and collective goals into focus. Soon it's announced by superiors that arrive one early morning at wake-up that the soldiers may take second jobs in town if they choose. At night, the winter winds biting, the men Sweeney and Hanson figure that if they haven't found something to do at 8 p.m., they will just go to the theater or to a tavern or a dance hall together. They get along better together than with anyone else. When they were among the only ones staying in, these 2 soldiers make their own changes, burning the fire warmer, making their own adjustments to the rooms, doing press-ups and sit-ups together, sometimes bathing at the same time, and retiring early, the stone walls like a cochlea, amplifying the cycles of their sleeping breath. As Hanson's leg healed, they went for a long walk in the evening, getting to know the different parts of town, walking through the woods together, circling back through town, coming home with purchases. There is intimacy laced into the stone kernel on the moonlit shoreline where the men fall asleep in a warm state. It was better for the 2 being in close proximity at night, since they seemed to be, legs tangled in blankets, engaged in constant conversation, hearing together, chest rising and falling, about how the other soldiers are slowly becoming part-time workers at the grocers, the blacksmiths, the glass blowers, and the masons. Sweeney and Hanson together successfully solicit jobs at Hanson's uncle's clothing business, for which they acquire new suits, hats, scarves, gloves, pins, and cufflinks, and as a consequence, they go out to a club where Mr. Grist reads newspapers, dines and drinks with his male business acquaintances, and where they become well liked. They go to the fort for mess dinners, dressed in capes with smart shoes and their utmost livery. Hanson to these occasions wears his great-grandmother Veronica's ruby. The soldier's routine is preserved through the uncertainty of change. Rising in the morning together with all the soldiers, they eat breakfast and climb up to the gun platform to fastidiously clean their rifles, and then to repeat a daily 50-year-old British military training regimen. All the men have gotten to know each other well, and they call out to each. Work is sometimes accompanied by whistling and unconscious singing that is echoed in the fortification's stone walls. On top of the shared training and activities, in the evening there is a lot of time wasting and hours of conversation. The shouting ring of punctual military doings accompanied the men regularly on drills at the large fort on the hill above the city. Military parades were held for the benefit of public events, and boots came down together left and right in the snow on the penny bridge crossing over the frozen water. The men persisted in exercises with other soldiers who were stationed elsewhere in town. As crackling winter emerged onto the land, there was the softness of the idyll and idyll, and the hushing of something soothed by gradually accomplishing a mother's love, and placid determination which projects a victory of unuse. Manned for 37 years, the neglect of a small one of many wedding war cakes, which in this realm of fantasy poetic vignette is woman choreographed. The married soldiers have left the fortress altogether. Others discharged from the large fort and marched by officials in the cold with their kit to the beautiful stone cake gun hut. Those days Sweeney and Hansen walked together through the new property marked out to be a park that had been partially cleared along King Street and near the site of the courthouse. In the distance, women and men are seen walking regularly here, now even in the winter in front of some of the mansions. Officials emerge for the first time from carriages to the old Parliament building turned courthouse. Hansen and Sweeney have seen another soldier off and married as of the weekend. They are no longer looking for a prospect for Hansen, and with deep concern and compassion, Sweeney sees his crestfallen friend question everything he's thought about himself. As everyone is getting used to cold and ice, there is an air of acceptance and sadness, and a lot of stunned drunkenness amongst the men who, like Hansen, have no marriageable prospect and wish to be married. It's clear to everyone why an old soldier would want to defect south of the border in one hopeful escapade, if the alternative is to accept one's age and lot and possibly live one's life alone, without a wife he presumed he'd have. It wasn't unusual for Sweeney and Hansen to see men standing in the street, drunk, staring into the cold darkness in the night, looking unselected and even abandoned. From time to time at night, as the two arrive closer to the fortification and onto the plank leading to the fortress, Amos and Sweeney see the drunken off-time leanings on the limestone walls and other soldiers barfing into snowbanks, and the secret comings and goings of fallen women. Regularly coming home from trips out to town at night, there are secret whispers barely audible to Samuel and Amos, curling cold from somewhere in the fortification. By drunken candlelights extinguishing soldiers sometimes have fallen down together even, Hansen in the dark notices. Course of a few days between Sweeney and Hansen, Hansen falls into a depression, and Sweeney does everything he can to care for him. English officials and a group of acquaintances, their black suits and bucket top hats, tendered beaver pelts, indigenously trapped and then sold to the Hudson Bay Company, rush importantly out of carriages away from the mess of horses into City Hall, beneath the great clock, or stand in groups discussing things on the edge of streets flanking the market square. Men carriage from businesses to their mansions and the Prince George Hotel. There is for family life church and a choir on Sunday. The indigenous traders and wanderers staying in lodging houses through town might spy an old British man of war and builders drinking together too. The memory and concern for arguments with their indigenous allies are easily drunk away now. They won't suffer because the numbers of their allies, their decades-long war partner and co-landowner, has in great numbers perished from European disease. En masse, the settlers have also materialized the intent of residential schools. Native daughters as well as sons are being admitted now. Hollows and hollows amongst all those who man the abundant fortifications and procure provisions for fighting wars and the dealings all around war in the port town. Wives of officers and their daughters who are wives to be fold a Hudson Bay point blanket that's 60 years old from grandfather's office in the British Army and put in a drawer, and individuals are buying books from England and America from book dealers, getting fresh words from the world's centers of gravity, no longer being one. A replica of the Silver Covenant chain treaty of Joseph Brant is metaphorically at the back of a dust-covered jewelry box in a Kingston attic, and shoes in the foyer are interspersed with snow and the fall leavings, frost and slate, freezing rain with names of indigenous trees and flowers, taught to the children in school by nuns, and in sunshine relayed to their delighted mothers in August, now November. People of Kingston and soldiers are in a routine of winter business, new belts cut for old buckles, footwear repaired, a clean and pressed uniform by the washerwoman who mends the clothes too. Every mechanism on the fortification by the shore housing 24 men is inspected. Thank goodness the cistern beneath the floor in the fortification works. Snow falls to soothe the emotional and psychologically drifting down through stages of grief, summer to autumn to winter, and simultaneously further to a quiet grief that takes a prospective, powerful city to a small pet town, and other feelings of loss present. Hanson and Sweeney have their final discussion about finding Hanson a woman to marry, which leaves Sweeney with a sadness in his heart and a feeling that he has contributed to his friend's disappointment in life. Everywhere the stones stand anyway, with over 100 years and more of lasting power where they're built with this kind of care, whatever they're about. And in particular, this defense mechanism I speak of was built with walls 8 to 15 feet deep, so that an incoming cannonball would bounce off the side of it. Sweeney gets a parcel sent from his loving mother in England at the beginning of November and excitedly shows Hanson. Hanson, on a special exercise earlier that day, missed Sweeney in the morning, who stays home with a cough, and in the heart of the mother's change brought on by chrysalis stone, realizes idly how the building never lets them get away from anyone too long, and seems to assist in constantly bringing one into another's presence, as if that's the whole reason it was built. Everyday maneuvers, marching practices for public parade events, drills, exercises, climbing up and down through the fortress in a file, executing cleaning duties, inspections and so on, bringing them together and apart. Coming home from church on off hours, there is a rumination from the whole landed company about soldiers, Britishers, church, devils and angels, temptation, heaven and hell, Jesus Christ and the settler man, ringing through everyone's heads as they trudge home together through the snow. When measuring up who is a temptation, or who is of heaven and who isn't, to one another, Sweeney and Hanson know the other to be good and trustworthy, most loving, and among the best he has ever known. Considering everyone this way, Hanson sees the swarthy Sweeney with warmth in his eyes like coals burning. So intense and sincere Sweeney sees in persevering and sensitive Hanson what it seems the others don't understand. One of the soldiers relays that the violent and turbulent officer Lark has been staying at a house of prostitution because he's in love and has proposed to one of the women. Everyone dropped the subject. Most of the men had been to prostitutes in town by now. Washerwomen and former prostitutes were now considered by some soldiers to be marriageable. In the meantime, some roughhousing and strange play was developing in this unique household, and it must be said, lovely architectural achievement. At night, happily roughhousing, Sweeney just finds himself pretending to pummel Hanson from a strange and charged energy in order to cheer him up. This onset of winter cold and heart phoenix fire inside, all in contrast, relaxed on every room. Both up long before sunrise, they spent time together before starting the day. Hanson paid extra attention to Sweeney, noticing even the remnants of cylindrical blazing starflower in a red ribbon in Sweeney's kit from his mother. Time marches slower and soldiers march faster in the cold. Sweeney considers idly if he would transmit his cold and cough Hanson if he were to kiss him in private, something like compassion in his heart for his friend, pain he himself could feel. This somehow caused him to do everything faster and more silently, something like urgency, something like redemption. Amongst all the doings of busy life that was accepted of the true posture of manhood growing and developing in them all in a way that seemed very fast, Sweeney's supportive embrace, like a furnace, a heart with fuel can burn hot, even in the midst of the unrelenting bitterness and heavy snowfalls of the season. Sweeney's reacting heart, racing up the stone steps to the gun sights and down again, somehow as if caught in a fast hot jolt streaming up out of a cavern. sent in the same direction, and down again, all the men swirling and jostle, and these two coming together and apart to cool and heat up, and flow like stone melted in a tectonic eruption. In the midst of their day's beginnings and ends, they from time to time set out apart with opposite aims, only to end up together, as if there was a dialogue about it, over the heat of connection continued with both passionate words about other things and wordless exchanges in their minds. Hansen to Sweeney in bodies worked together well, and lived together well, played together with others when their commitments were fulfilled. Both of them felt compelled as a matter of course to mention the other's name in letters home to their mothers. These two soldiers were unconsciously paired naturally and inevitably in the minds of all the soldiers for innocent reasons. Anyone could see how they communicated and looked so good together. They didn't seem really to be alone. The other unmarried men froggers did anyway, who were managing their own transformations for better or for worse. The heat in the cores like sun in August, haunting in their torsos the ghosts of summer, and the indigenous flowers spied years ago men of different tribes from all directions, like a meeting in Cataraqui, to familiarize themselves, friend and foe, in summer heat with each other, and look on the faces and hot arms of the season before the Europeans arrived. Sweeney and Hansen saw each other. Fire cozied into these two men's hearts, through the mist and smoke of the winter frost and ice. The feeling of summer days of once ghost, in boats floating near hot shoreline past alternate leaf dogwood tree. Blue beach floated, occupying their rib cages. The waiting men in winter went through the motions of life with some beat drawing them faster. Virginia bluebells reached up to the sun in the summer, as one man now reaching up toward the man beside him on the stone steps to touch his leg. The long-ago boat in hot sun streaming past the pin cherry. Sweeney deliberately moneys up and pours out the sensible Hansen, truly drunk for the first time together at the tavern by the shipyards, with the spirit of heart-leafed aster, scarlet bee-balm, and they cradle each other to the fortress. Darkness kisses him good night to their close-by beds in stupor, to wake up blinded, each exposed inside undercovers to the solar hotness. Flowers, white turtle head, smooth oxide jumping through the day and waiting to the end of the drill, risking being caught in the blinked-out dark, or lots of lost communications taken by the roar of their blood, like a ghost crash of the summer storm, and periodic waves. The men pressed in their own heat against the cold and dark, against the back wall of the fortress, in hairy beard tongue, choked cherry, shagbark hickory, dense blazing star, and foam flower, and they learned over the course of months how again to get back to that place. At times they would be two in one bed together, in the fortification after dark. Another few men in the regiment also stayed together in the same beds, and it was now a joke, and it was taken lightly, since some of the others were now involved in their own intrigues with women. Said Sweeney to Hansen, "I don't know if I'm fit for loving you and deserve to have you, but I feel like I need this to survive." The other men admired that at least they didn't have to find a woman. When they were happy enough with each other, they had found an efficient and economical solution. One night far past midnight, when some of the men had snuck out or were still drinking, and the men who had retired to bed, some entangled with each other, there was a shouting and crying from a guttural, roaring voice outside. Someone was spilled in the snow beside the stone wall of the little fort, drunk, asking for one of the soldiers to come down. Hansen and Sweeney got up and opened the door in their warm, smartly trimmed night robes and beautiful warm slippers, and saw Officer Lark in a pile. "Can we get a sight on him and shoot him?" said Hansen. "Otherwise, what good is this gun house anyway?" Hansen and Sweeney were joined by a couple of others, and they went out with lanterns. "Is that you, Lark?" Lark screamed incoherently for a while. "Help me into the gun house, you swine. I want to talk to Sims. I just want to ask him something. I will kill all of yous bloody frogs if you say anything about it." "What do you want Sims for?" "I'm banned from the cat house. She doesn't want me. Besides, now I've kissed a frog," and he turned into a prince. Lark laughed. sounding a bit demented, but somehow more eloquent when all the way drunk. "We'd prefer to throw you in the ditch if you were going to be threatening." "No, no!" "Yes, it will be fine," said Sweeney. "We'll just throw you in the ditch and leave you there. Check on you in the morning." "No, I'll die. Please help me. I'm your friend. I'm your friend. I'm cold." "You are not our friend. I don't know if we can help a violent drunk like you. Please help me. I won't do anything. I won't kill you, I promise. If you kick us, we'll throw you in the river and say you jumped in and killed yourself." "No, I won't kick." Eventually the 4 soldiers dragged him in. Lark wept. "I cannot believe I'm here at no place at all with you Nancys. I've been left behind like a dog pile in a backwater by everyone, including King Edward VII Rex Britannia, no capital, and a 19-year-old tea biscuit queen, and a whore who doesn't want me either. If Sims and I can reach an understanding, well, that would be different. I'm not too proud. You fellas would know." Officer Lark's no longer enthusiastic love interest earlier that day left suddenly after complaining of feeling sick and escaping to recuperate. Hansen said, "We all, including Sims, find you off-putting." Lark groaned and clenched his teeth. Sweeney said, "Yes, most of us don't want anything to do with you." As Samuel was closing the door, he said, "You are lucky to have had a prostitute once. I hope you paid her well." "Okay then," Lark said. "Good enough." The men locked Lark into the room for the night. Afterward, with Lark, there was no pretense, and he began to pursue men more overtly. Eventually, even one of Lark's painful overtures was partially accepted by one of the men behind the gun-house in the snow. It wasn't long after that Lark completely disappeared, rumored to have crossed the border. At Christmas, Hansen and Sweeney dined lavishly at the Grists. Gifts and toasts exchanged, music, singing, and dancing. Through all the doings and meetings of the season, and the new year and fashion and shipments and periodicals, events and new arrivals, there were new possibilities in front of the two of them, as if growing red and green in a summer garden, with new fresh clothes from the holiday. Hansen very smartly dressed in new clothes and new boots, fresh haircut, and a new relaxed sense of humor, because he told his mother by letter and Aunt Margaret all about Sweeney, and they approved. The two come in late at night, babbling happily about this and that. "Keep it down, we all have work in the morning," someone said. Sweeney and Hansen embraced, and Sweeney says to Hansen in his ear, "You are my job." In the night, Hansen asks Sweeney, "What do you think about when I'm not here?" Said Hansen, "When we're apart, I think about the world that surrounds you, and I try to make things easier for you. If only we could get rid of everyone and we could live here in the fortress on our own." Demoted from keepers of the capital, the remaining Kingston officials of the new municipal government carry on. Now they are repeating the sentiment in City Hall that's emerging from the government, how the indigenous people need to try harder, improve themselves, and be sufficiently advanced in order to participate in English society. They recommend a fundamental change in their lifestyles, more like European people. It's like taking off one set of clothes and putting on another, they seem to imply. Just be a different kind of person, that's all. A general disconnected, mean, disrespectful, and unhelpful sentiment. In the winter months, throngs of British and settler men engaged in hunting on foot or on horseback in the forests. The spring thaw came through slowly. Sweeney said to Hansen, "I've found an apartment for us to rent together over Princess Street. I'm reaching up. I'm making the most of our connections." Kingston at gatherings was now being spoken of in recession, having lost a lot of crown money and some of the wealthiest citizens. This was a bad deal for Kingston, but because of this, Hansen and Sweeney were able to find very nice accommodations for a very good price. There was a strong and cooperative business presence in the city, looking to grow into the places the British Empire left behind. Persons with wealth in their hearts in step with the wealthy world marched on, inevitably, and new clothes and animal meat were needed and ordered. As always, time marched on, bringing greater complexity to the city. Customers put in requests for light suits and dresses that are ostensibly for Easter, which makes sense in England. One would need a new light floral dress or a gray suit in March. Unlike in England, however, the ground in Kingston is still frozen and snow-covered, sometimes until the end of March, and there is sometimes snowfall as late as April and May, so new light dresses for Easter are usually purchased before anyone can wear them. The shops and windows and bakeries are full of hot crust buns. The ice on the water breaks up. The rigidity of the season before makes waves. The past melts away with ice, and the weather going through 3 or 4 of the seasons every day. There's heavy rain and sunshine, heavy mist alternating with high winds and new weather systems. Everything is on the move again. Amos Hansen and Samuel Sweeney go out walking in the woods by the shore and shout that they love each other over blasts of winds off the water. They participate in chess games by lamplight at the pub and go drinking with British and settler men, frequent the theatre and dance halls, and attend events as a pair. Once in dense fog of the early morning they kiss passionately in Market Square, cloaked in white and invisible. They said passionately and impractically, "Let's visit Europe. Let's plan our wedding. Let's plan a secret honeymoon." The Grists with their carriages and extra household hands come to help Hansen and Sweeney move. His cousin wasn't there. There is news that Leonora is engaged to someone that she's been seeing for months. The helpers the family brought and other soldiers bring crates to the carriages. The Grists gossip with those standing around and inspect the fortress as the men are packing their goods to move. A washerwoman is there too, to collect the laundry from the soldiers. Margaret Hansen said to the washerwoman, "I guess it wouldn't be so bad if they removed the guns and cannons and put real windows inside. It's actually a very pretty shape. It looks like a lady with all of the curves and blooms at the bottom. Even the little ditch is pretty." "It is very pretty. Even the ditch is," said the washerwoman. "I think in fact it would make a very nice house. And besides, that's a southern-facing wall, which would be perfect for growing vegetables. You could feed a whole family with this land." For the part of the 24 soldiers or so remaining, sometimes there are women on their minds, sometimes reaching up under cover of the night. In the cavern fortress there is secret love, there is betrayal sometimes. New individuals experience denial of love, choosing one over another. Jealousy, a dance of commitment and lust, separation and discovery goes on in peaceful times. So much happens in secret. The mother has won the day. Leonora has a late marriage to a merchant's son. Sweeney and Hansen consider the structure that housed them and they've left behind, that has been left behind by its institution, by its historical context, and in general. The abandonment of this first shared place makes the acceptance of some new value possible. This is what lovers valued in this hypothetical writing, an imaginary other made-up world, the description carried in the writer's unchilded mother's heart, and in stone places, in other sets of coordinates in time, a thing. In time, a thing abandoned accepts what comes to it, because it's only an inanimate thing. The strength of this construction, likely at this stage, will excitingly outlast every plan. Well, that's nice.